In the modern era of the UFC, very few fighters have blurred the line between champion and cultural phenomenon the way Israel Adesanya has. Known worldwide as the last stylebender, Adesanya did not rise through brute force alone. He rose through precision, personality, and a striking style that looked more like art than violence. From Lagos, Nigeria, to Auckland, New Zealand, his journey transformed him into one of the most recognizable faces of the UFC during the 2019-2023 era. A dominant reign as UFC Middleweight Champion, legendary performances against Robert Whittaker, Kelvin Gastelum, and Paulo Costa, and an aura that made every fight feel like an event. But the higher Israel Adesanya climbed, the louder the questions became. Why did one of the most technically gifted champions also become one of the most polarizing figures in the sport? Why did moments of brilliance begin to coexist with backlash, controversy, and public discomfort? And why did the UFC, an organization built on control and image management, appear both empowered by Adesanya and increasingly exposed by him? This is not just a story about wins and losses. It is a story about identity, ego, and the cost of standing out in a system that rewards dominance but fears unpredictability. As Adesanya's fame exploded, so did the scrutiny surrounding his behavior, his mindset, and his relationship with the audience that once celebrated him unconditionally. To understand how Israel Adesanya became both the UFC's most valuable middleweight asset and one of its most controversial champions, the story must begin long before the belts, the spotlight, and the backlash, back when fighting was not a performance, but an escape. Long before he became a global UFC icon, Israel Adesanya was a quiet, introspective teenager trying to find identity in a world where he felt invisible. Born in 1,989 inches, Lagos, Nigeria, Adesanya spent his early childhood surrounded by cultural expectations that valued conformity over self-expression. That changed when his family relocated to Auckland, New Zealand, a move that would reshape his future but also deepen his sense of isolation. In school, Adesanya struggled with bullying, alienation, and the pressure to fit in. It was during this period that he discovered anime, martial arts films, and eventually kickboxing, not as a sport at first, but as a form of escape and self-definition. Unlike many UFC prospects, Israel Adesanya built his foundation outside the octagon. He accumulated an unusually long and demanding career in kickboxing and boxing, competing across multiple countries and styles. By the time he transitioned to mixed martial arts, he had already fought dozens of times at a professional level, sharpening timing, distance control, and psychological warfare. This background made him immediately different. When Adesanya entered the UFC, he did not fight like a traditional middleweight. He moved like a lightweight, struck like a kickboxer, and thought like a tactician. His rise was fast and unmistakable. Victories over established names signaled that this was not hype, but evolution. Analysts began describing him as a once-in-a-generation striker, someone capable of dismantling opponents without absorbing damage. The defining moment of his ascent came at UFC 236 in the interim title fight against Kelvin Gastelum. Over 5 brutal rounds, Adesanya displayed endurance, creativity, and mental resilience that stunned even seasoned observers. That fight did more than crown a champion, it announced the arrival of a new archetype. Soon after, Israel Adesanya unified the title and dismantled Robert Whittaker, ending an undefeated run and claiming the UFC Middleweight Championship with surgical precision. From that point forward, the division revolved around him. Fighters were no longer asking how to win the belt, they were asking how to solve Adesanya. But with dominance came attention, and with attention came expectation. The traits that once made him fascinating, his personality, his expressions, his refusal to mute himself, began to draw scrutiny. As the wins stacked up, the spotlight shifted, and the higher Israel Adesanya climbed, the closer he came to a collision between brilliance and backlash that would soon redefine his career. As Israel Adesanya reached the peak of the UFC middleweight division, the conversation around him began to change. The focus slowly drifted away from technique and dominance, toward behavior, perception, and moments that fractured public opinion. Unlike scandals built on legal trouble or suspensions, Adesanya's controversies were rooted in visibility, interpretation, and the unforgiving nature of modern sports culture. Every gesture, every post, every celebration was amplified far beyond the octagon, turning personality into liability. One of the earliest flashpoints came from Adesanya's post-fight celebrations and public statements. What he viewed as expression and performance was, to many fans and commentators, excessive or uncomfortable. Moments that would have been ignored for quieter champions became headlines simply because of who he was and how visible he had become. Social media accelerated the backlash, transforming brief clips into long-running narratives that questioned his maturity, intent, and mental state. For the first time, Israel Adesanya was no longer universally admired, he was being dissected. The scrutiny intensified during his title reign, particularly as his fighting style evolved. Victories that were once celebrated for brilliance began to draw criticism for being too cautious, too tactical, or lacking spectacle. High-profile bouts against fighters like Yoel Romero and later Jared Cannonier triggered debates about entertainment versus effectiveness. While Adesanya continued to win, the narrative shifted dangerously. The champion was no longer thrilling everyone. In the UFC's ecosystem, that shift matters. Outside the cage, questions also emerged regarding testing optics, sparked largely by online speculation rather than official findings. Though no formal wrongdoing was established, the visual narrative circulating on social platforms added fuel to an already polarized environment. The UFC remained publicly supportive, but the silence around these discussions created a vacuum where rumor thrived. In an era where perception often outweighs fact, Israel Adesanya became vulnerable to narratives he could not fully control. Perhaps the most defining blow to his aura came with defeat. When Alex Pereira knocked him out to claim the middleweight title, it was more than a loss, it was a symbolic rupture. The undefeated mystique, the sense of inevitability, vanished overnight. And with it came a harsher tone from critics who had been waiting for confirmation that the champion was fallible. Although Adesanya reclaimed the title in the rematch, the damage to his invincibility was already done. Each controversy, each debated moment, chipped away at the simplicity of his image. Israel Adesanya was no longer just the artist fighter. He had become a lightning rod for cultural arguments about masculinity, expression, and what a champion is allowed to be. For the UFC, this created a complex equation. He was still dominant, still valuable, still a global draw, but he was no longer safe. And behind every controversy, behind every headline and backlash cycle, there was an undeniable reality the organization could not ignore. Israel Adesanya was generating something far more powerful than approval. He was generating attention. And attention, when measured in dollars, is the most dangerous currency of all. In the UFC, dominance creates relevance, but money determines leverage. By the time Israel Adesanya reached the height of his middleweight reign, he was no longer just a champion, he was a financial pillar. Between 2019 and 2023, Adesanya consistently ranked among the UFC's top earners, driven not only by victories, but by his ability to sell fights globally. Each title defense came with a growing fight purse, escalating PPV points, and layered incentives that placed him firmly in the upper tier of the promotion's pay structure. While exact figures were rarely disclosed in full, estimates surrounding his championship bouts suggested earnings that rivaled, and at times surpassed, many stars outside the heavyweight division. What set Israel Adesanya apart was not just how much he earned, but how he earned it. Unlike fighters who relied purely on knockout hype, Adesanya sold narratives identity, artistry, rivalry, and cultural relevance. His fights attracted audiences across North America, Europe, Africa, and Oceania, giving the UFC something rare: a middleweight champion with genuine global market reach. This reach translated directly into sponsorship appeal, brand partnerships, lifestyle endorsements, and crossover visibility within gaming, fashion, and pop culture expanded his income far beyond the octagon. From the UFC's perspective, Adesanya represented a different kind of asset. He was not just a belt holder, he was a content generator. Press conferences, embedded episodes, countdowns, and promotional materials revolved around his persona. Even when public opinion split, engagement numbers remained high. And in modern combat sports, engagement equals revenue. Love him or hate him, fans watched. This financial gravity created an imbalance of power that the UFC had to manage carefully. Israel Adesanya was valuable enough to protect, but influential enough to become a liability if mishandled. Unlike fringe contenders, he could negotiate from a position of strength. He could headline events, anchor international cards, and drive pay-per-view sales without needing manufactured drama. That made him difficult to pressure and impossible to ignore. The deeper issue lay in valuation. The UFC has long operated on the principle that no individual fighter is bigger than the brand. Yet champions like Israel Adesanya quietly challenge that philosophy. When a single athlete becomes synonymous with an entire division, the balance shifts. Losing him would not simply mean losing a champion, it would mean destabilizing the middleweight division itself. This is why money mattered more than controversy. Criticism could be absorbed, backlash could be managed, but financial dependency could not be erased. Israel Adesanya had become too profitable, too visible, and too entrenched to be easily replaced. And as his wealth and influence grew, so did the stakes of every decision surrounding him. Because when money and power intersect in the UFC, the fight is no longer just inside the cage. It moves into contracts, timing, matchmaking, and control. And that battle would soon collide with the most revealing part of Adesanya's story, the life he lived when the cameras were turned off. Away from the controlled environment of the octagon, Israel Adesanya lives in a space where contradiction defines almost everything. Fame brought wealth, freedom, and influence, but it also amplified isolation. Unlike champions who disappeared into private routines, Adesanya leaned fully into visibility. His lifestyle blended art, anime, fashion, music, and constant online presence, creating a persona that felt closer to a performance artist than a traditional fighter. To supporters, this made him authentic. To critics, it made him exposed. This constant self-expression came at a cost. Social media turned from a tool into a battlefield, where every post was interpreted, clipped, and weaponized. Israel Adesanya was no longer only judged for how he fought, but for how he behaved, spoke, and presented himself when no fight was scheduled. The pressure to remain interesting never stopped. Silence risked irrelevance. Visibility risked backlash. That tension shaped his daily life and slowly eroded the boundary between the fighter and the audience consuming him. Behind the confidence and bravado, there were visible signs of internal strain. Interviews revealed moments of defensiveness, emotional volatility, and a recurring theme of fighting expectations rather than opponents. Israel Adesanya often spoke about legacy, respect, and being misunderstood, signals of a champion carrying more than physical pressure. Success had not simplified his world, it had complicated it. Wealth and fame multiplied voices around him while shrinking the number he could trust. Relationships became part of the narrative as well. While Adesanya kept much of his personal life guarded, moments of vulnerability surfaced in public discussions, fueling speculation and debate. The more he tried to assert control over his image, the more fragmented it became. For a fighter whose style depended on rhythm, timing, and clarity, this psychological noise mattered. The cage does not exist in isolation. What happens outside inevitably follows fighters inside. This lifestyle fed directly into the controversies discussed earlier. Public reactions became harsher. Victories were no longer enough. Losses were magnified. When Israel Adesanya stumbled, critics framed it as proof of distraction, ego, or decline. When he succeeded, the praise felt conditional. The champion was trapped in a loop where authenticity attracted attention, attention attracted judgment, and judgment demanded response. Yet this same complexity made him invaluable. The UFC does not thrive on silence, it thrives on conversation. Israel Adesanya generated it constantly, without scripts, without filters, without needing manufactured villains. His lifestyle blurred sport and culture, pulling in audiences who might never care about rankings or techniques. That reach came directly from the very traits that made him difficult to manage. And that leads to the uncomfortable truth. The problem was never Adesanya's lifestyle. The problem was that it worked. It created relevance that could not be engineered, and in an organization built on control, nothing is more dangerous than a champion whose influence extends far beyond the cage. For the UFC, losing Israel Adesanya would never be just about losing a champion. It would mean losing a pillar that quietly held the middleweight division together for years. From 2019 onward, the division revolved around a single question: who could solve Adesanya? Contenders rose, styles clashed, rivalries formed, but all of it pointed back to him. That level of centrality is rare, and the UFC understood exactly how fragile the division would become without it. The first reason is simple and unavoidable: pay-per-view power. Israel Adesanya consistently headlined major events, often without the need for artificial hype. His fights sold because audiences trusted one thing: something memorable would happen. Whether fans tuned in to admire his technique or to see him lose, they tuned in. That reliability made him a safer financial bet than many louder personalities whose appeal burned out quickly. In the UFC's calculus, consistency equals security. The second factor is global reach. Adesanya is not tied to a single market. His background connects Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Europe, and North America, allowing the UFC to push events, narratives, and branding across continents. Few champions offer that kind of cultural flexibility. Losing him would not just weaken one division, it would fracture multiple regional audiences that the UFC spent years cultivating. Then there is symbolism. Israel Adesanya represented a modern evolution of fighting precision over brawling, intelligence over brute force, identity over uniformity. For younger fans, he became proof that a fighter could be different and still dominate. For the UFC, that symbolism was double-edged. It attracted new demographics while challenging old promotional formulas. But once that door was opened, it could not be closed. Removing Adesanya would signal retreat, not control. There is also the issue of replacement. Middleweight contenders came and went, but none combined skill, personality, media presence, and durability the way Adesanya did. Some had power, some had charisma, some had momentum. None had the full equation. Without him, the division risked returning to short reigns, vacant titles, and fragmented narratives, outcomes the UFC had already experienced and wanted to avoid. The final and most uncomfortable truth is this: Israel Adesanya did not need the UFC in the way many champions do. Financially secure, globally known, and culturally relevant, he possessed leverage that could not be erased by matchmaking alone. That independence shifted the power dynamic. The UFC could not simply pressure him into silence or conformity without risking backlash or loss. This is why the relationship always felt tense. Not because the UFC disliked Adesanya, but because they depended on him. And dependence, in a system built on control, is a vulnerability. Which leads to the question that defines his entire era: was the UFC protecting Israel Adesanya, or was it quietly afraid of what the middleweight division would become without him? When the era of Israel Adesanya is eventually placed under the microscope of history, it will not be remembered as simple or comfortable. It will be remembered as complex, divided, and deeply revealing. On one hand, Adesanya stands as one of the most technically gifted middleweight champions the UFC has ever produced. His movement, precision, and fight intelligence reshaped how the division was fought. On the other hand, his reign exposed the limits of how much individuality the sport truly tolerates. Adesanya's legacy is not defined by perfection, it is defined by tension. Between art and combat, between expression and expectation, between control and freedom. He forced the UFC and its audience to confront an uncomfortable reality. Dominance does not always look the way tradition demands, and when it does not, the system reacts. The central question surrounding Israel Adesanya is no longer about wins or losses. It is about authorship. Who truly controlled his career? The organization that promoted him? The public that consumed him? Or Adesanya himself, navigating fame, ego, and identity in real time? Each answer reveals a different truth, and none of them are fully satisfying. What is certain is this: the impact of Israel Adesanya will outlast titles and statistics. He changed the culture of the middleweight division, expanded the boundaries of what a UFC champion could be, and left behind a blueprint that future fighters will either follow or be punished for attempting. And as the UFC continues to evolve, one fact remains impossible to ignore. The story of Israel Adesanya is not over, but no matter how it ends, the questions he raised about power, control, and individuality will remain long after the noise fades and the cage doors close.